Hi everyone, my name is Ian McLaughlin and I have a PhD in neuroscience, and today I want to talk about a condition that isn't really well known, but has somewhat recently benefited from some serious engagement by neuroscientists: misophonia. And so misophonia is a term that describes when people experience a really severe reaction to certain sounds in their environment that wouldn't typically elicit such a severe reaction, a severe emotional reaction. And so that may sound a little weird and maybe hard to understand for somebody who doesn't experience this, but we all kind of experience certain levels of misophonia. And so probably the most classic example would be nails on a chalkboard. And, this is probably a largely antiquated example at this point, given that I imagine chalkboards are becoming less and less common in classrooms and stuff, replaced by whiteboards or computers or projectors or whatever. But this is probably the most universal sound that's consistently able to elicit that severe emotional reaction in pretty much everyone. And so, frankly, just looking at this picture elicits a sort of a small dose, at least, a dose of that reaction, that I would have in real life if I were actually listening to it. And more importantly, actually seeing it happen, right? Somebody scratching a chalkboard. I don't know about you, but at least for me, it is really the sound mixed with that tactile sensory experience, right? Like I know what it feels like to have my nails scratch across a chalkboard, rather than just the sound alone. It's the combination that makes my skin crawl. And it elicits more than just an emotional reaction for me. I get a sort of goosebumpy, skin crawly kind of reaction. It's just gross and aversive and just definitely bad, right? And all of that is driven fundamentally by an emotional reaction to a sensory experience that really should have no significant emotional valence, right? It's not like there's anything dangerous about, scratching a chalkboard. It's not bad for you, right? It doesn't threaten your survival, So there's no obvious reason that a particular sensory experience, fingernails on a chalkboard, ought to have an instinctive disgust response, any more than fingernails on some wood or an apple or your skin or whatever, right? So that's sort of what we're talking about when it comes to misophonia. And but that reaction is extended in misophonia quite a bit more widely, right? Often to sounds that are just part of our everyday lives, right? Like normal sounds. And I'm almost trivializing just how severe the reaction in misophonia can be. We all cringe at fingernails on a chalkboard, but when it comes to misophonia, the emotional reactions can be considerably more severe than that. Rather than just cringing, folks who describe misophonia experience that same cringe and disgust, right? But it can lead to intense anger and rage or anxiety and the immediate desire to leave the source of this stimulation, right? To escape, in other words. Think flight in fight or flight. So, it's like if you heard fingernails on a chalkboard and you had your skin crawl and cringed and all that kind of stuff, and then you also began to despise your teacher for making that sound. You had intense anxiety over entering the classroom ever again, to an extent that your willingness to continue class can become compromised. And you immediately had the insatiable drive to physically leave the classroom upon hearing it, right? So I think it's safe to say that it's just a different level of reaction, right? And one might recognize, as I did, that I can't even really remember the last time I had to regularly deal with being exposed to nails on a chalkboard, right? But the problem with misophonia is that the sensory experiences that cause these reactions, which are called trigger sounds, are quite a bit more mundane and common in our daily lives. And so we're talking about things like the sounds of people breathing, or eating, and chewing and drinking, right? Just sounds at the table in general, right? At a dinner table, like the clinking of silverware on plates and stuff like that. But then also, sounds that just come from the mouth in general, right? Like brushing teeth, the sounds of a dry mouth, those kinds of things that are just kind of normal that we all encounter daily. But they even go further than that, right? So certain vocal sounds, like the S or P sound, right? Or vocal fry, right? Or gravelly voices, whispering, and things like vocal tics, for example, or like, right? Or things like throat clearing. And it just goes on and on, right? The sound of hair dryers or heavy footsteps, cracking knuckles, clocks ticking, right? You get the idea. These are the kinds of things that we all encounter every single day. But unless you experience misophonia, you just sort of like zone it out and don't really think about it very much. For someone with misophonia, it essentially becomes like an emotional crisis that's impossible to ignore, okay? And so I'm sure you can imagine that this can become quite a bit of a problem. In some cases, quite a bit of a problem, particularly since many of the sounds that trigger misophonia, reactions, or misophonic reactions, are essentially inescapable, right? When you're around other people just in general. So as a result, these reactions can cause people to isolate themselves from others, and they can often confront psychiatric conditions as a result. And so, despite gaining a kind of critical mass, right, in terms of people, describing this kind of a reaction, in online communities and stuff like that, misophonia isn't considered to be a formal diagnosable condition, right? There's like not a set of standards that characterize misophonia, like clinically. And so, it's still kind of nebulously understood and it's like as a characterized syndrome. So it's not in the DSM-5, right? So in other words, the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is basically like the primary manual that, clinicians use to diagnose psychiatric conditions. And it's not in the ICD-10, which is sort of like the equivalent of the DSM that's managed by the World Health Organization, the WHO, and it's used in many countries, outside the United States. And generally speaking, they tend to corroborate each other, right? They're pretty similar. And so, there's a whole history to misophonia. Not a long history, right, to be clear, but it really starts with another condition called tinnitus. Okay, and I'm not going to get into the connections between misophonia and tinnitus today, but I have a link to a past discussion of tinnitus in the description below if you're interested. And it kind of boils down to similarities in how severely unpleasant emotional reaction, or the emotional reaction that can occur to the experience of a sound, right? So in the case of tinnitus, it's that persistent ringing in your ears, like after you leave a loud concert or something like that, or listen to music at a high volume. In the case of misophonia, it does seem to be more complicated than just that. And so, since the condition hasn't been studied for a particularly long time, it's unclear just how many people are dealing with this. So, there's no like giant study that helps us to get a sense of how common it really is. But there have been some studies with college students that suggest somewhere between 6 to 20% of the students experienced moderate to severe symptoms of misophonia. And so I haven't read these studies, but, I imagine we can't really rely too heavily on those figures. And the biology of someone who's, the age of a college student is unique, hormonally, right, relative to a child or an adult. Okay, but, the studies do indicate that this isn't like a super rare condition. And so, just to give you a sense of how that 6 to 20% figure would compare to other conditions, the estimated proportion of the number of people who are over 60 years old, right, who are confronting dementia, this is very regularly studied and clinically confronted by a medical malady, right? Dementia, Alzheimer's, being the most common cause of it. That the estimated prevalence is somewhere between 5 to 8% worldwide. So even if only 6% of people deal with misophonia, right, the low end of the range that they identified, that puts it on a scale of conditions that are like universally agreed to be critical priorities to both understand scientifically, but then also to treat with better and better, science and medicine. So, what do we already understand about misophonia? Okay, so there's been some progress towards understanding like what's going on in the brain of somebody who's experiencing this condition, right? So if you were to ask essentially like any neuroscientist or like anyone, who's taken an introductory neuroscience course, if you were to ask them to guess what part of the brain would likely be centrally involved in this overly active, like disgust or emotionally super aversive reaction to pretty much any sound, they'd almost certainly all begin, as I would have, with the same brain region, the insula. Okay, and so, unsurprisingly, studies have suggested that activity in this brain region, the insula, is indeed involved in misophonia. And so just for anybody who's interested in, where this brain region is, you can sort of tell by these images. It's kind of a strange structure because it's actually located deep within a fold, right, or a sulcus, right, as we call them in the biz, the sort of valleys in our brain's wrinkles, and it's quite a large sulcus, by the way, as you can see, it's a very deep valley. It's called the lateral sulcus, and if you imagine the brain as like a boxing glove, right, or a fist, it would be the line that's formed along the top of your thumb, okay, and that line, that sulcus, separates the temporal lobe from the parietal and frontal lobes, okay? And like many brain structures, it's bilateral, the insula. In other words, you can think of sort of like we have two of them on either side, in either hemisphere of the brain, or on either side of the brain. Okay. So if you wanted to like poke around in my insula, you'd have to peel back, as you're seeing in this top image, you'd have to peel back both sides of that sulcus, peel back the two peaks that surround the valley to get in there. Okay, so that's enough anatomy. The point is, just as anybody with any exposure to neuroscience would have predicted, by past science, right, that's caused us to understand, what the neurons in that neighborhood, the insulin neighborhood of the brain, contribute to consciousness. We're talking disgust, empathy, connecting emotional reactions to the states of our body and our sensory experiences, including like pain, among many, many other things, right? It's it's involved in a lot of stuff, the insula. So a study in 2017 showed that hyperactivity in this particular brain region, the insula, was unique to individuals experiencing misophonia. So this study, which was conducted by a group across a whole bunch of places in the United Kingdom, like Cambridge, Newcastle University, University College London, and the University of Iowa, interestingly. They did a whole bunch of stuff, okay, including neuroimaging and stuff like that. But, just part of it was basically demonstrating that misophonia is like a measurable phenomenon, biological phenomenon, that some people experience. Okay. So I know that these couple figures will be from that study if you want to check it out, and I have links to all the studies I'll be talking about below if you're interested. I believe this one's open source, so you can just read it. You don't have to have a subscription. But anyway, so I know these graphs are like about as far from cool to see as possible, but just super briefly, okay, what you're seeing are the reactions of two sets of people, okay, people with misophonia on the top, okay, and then people without misophonia on the bottom, okay, and the scientists subjected them to three types of things: trigger sounds in red, sounds of eating, vocal fry, breathing, these types of things, and then unpleasant sounds, things like babies crying, people screaming, things that like everybody finds unpleasant, and then just neutral sounds, okay, like rain, or things that essentially nobody finds particularly aversive. And so what you're seeing is the scientists measure how these people's hearts reacted when they were exposed to those three types of sounds, as well as like sort of how sweaty and heated they got. And so the main point they're making is that if you look at that top left graph, okay, that one, how people with misophonia reacted, those lines most definitely don't overlap, right? And those trigger sounds, the red line, caused a hell of a greater response in both their heart rates as well as how sweaty they got, which is the top right graph, like right here. And so their heart rates became quite a bit higher when they were exposed to trigger sounds compared to neutral sounds, and the same was true for just how sweaty they became. Okay, and so if you look at the bottom graphs, you're seeing how people without misophonia reacted to trigger sounds, unpleasant sounds, and neutral sounds, and you can begin to see the difference here. Right, there's no real distinction in how their hearts reacted to any of these sounds. And while the hearts of people with misophonia do respond differently, particularly to trigger sounds, and they got sweatier in response to unpleasant sounds, right? While trigger sounds actually elicited the lowest sweatiness response. So we're looking at this graph here. So in other words, exactly what you'd expect, what you'd predict in someone without any condition related to how they respond to certain sounds. And so just by the way, just in terms of terminology, I'm calling it a sweatiness response. These under GSR. And that's not really entirely accurate. They're measuring galvanic skin response, which is slightly more complicated than just sweatiness, but it is close enough pretty much. So who cares? Okay. Well, this shows that there's definitely a measurable difference in people who claim to have these misophonic reactions to sounds that don't really have any effect in people without the condition. Not only that, the things that they measured are extremely difficult, if not impossible, to fake. Right? You can't just like decide to elevate your heart rate or sweatiness. These are things that the brain automatically induces in you in certain situations. And so in the case of people with misophonia, the brain is automatically activating those responses, those processes, in situations that compared to people without the reaction might be considered inappropriate, right? Incompatible with the nature of the sounds. Somebody's just breathing. Why are you having such an intense response? Okay, and so they did some science to hone in on the insula being sort of responsible for causing people with misophonia to experience these elevations of heart rate and sweatiness. So here we go. So don't worry about it. I know it seems like a little bit complicated, but don't worry about it. The point is that, they have some evidence suggesting that, if you're looking for a brain region, or the brain region, that seems to be particularly responsible for causing people with misophonia to have these deeply unpleasant reactions to otherwise innocuous sounds. Again, breathing, somebody eating near you. We can blame it on them having a unique insula, okay? That unique insula is putting out a unique series of signals to a whole variety of other brain regions that cause them to experience that deep anger, anxiety, even hate when they hear you, chewing a burrito or something. Okay, so, this seems like a real thing, in other words, that's causing real people real suffering. Okay, so why am I bringing up misophonia today? Well, a study was published just a little while ago that adds a bit more sort of color to, our tapestry of our understanding of what's going on in the brains of people who experience misophonia. And so, to be clear, the group who's publishing this paper is composed of several of the same people, right? And so for all intents and purposes, it's essentially the same group who published the first paper that we discussed, right? That measured heart rate and sweatiness and stuff like that. So, but this is a different study, or maybe more accurately, it helps to really hone in on what precisely is going on when people have these misophonic reactions beyond just, unique insular activity. And so, fundamentally what they're arguing, to cut to the chase, is that misophonia isn't simply a disgust reaction to a sound, like chewing or breathing or specific words, vowels, consonants, which at least for me was what I would have assumed is going on, right? It's actually not that simple. And the mechanism that they identify is pretty interesting. So, short story. What seems to be happening is that people experiencing misophonia, when hearing a certain sound, are kind of very vividly imagining what it's like when they produce the same sounds, that they're hearing, and they hate that experience. So they call it hyper mirroring. Okay, and so just to be more concrete, when someone with misophonia, cringes and hates when they're hearing somebody audibly breathing through their mouth, right? They imagine themselves breathing through their mouths, and experience that disgust reaction because they hate it when they themselves do that same thing. Okay, and so interestingly, so that they hone in on the experiences that we have, during that process of hyper mirroring, or when they're imagining, they hone in on the experiences that we have at the center of our sort of face, our mouth, right? Or I'm sorry, that center, on our face, on our mouth, and our throat. Okay, and that does kind of make sense. After all, many of those trigger sounds involve exactly those things: eating sounds, breathing sounds, specific vocal sounds, right, and so on, right? So that makes sense that there would be, some unique pattern of brain activity that really focuses on this sort of part of the body, right, specifically the muscles that control them. Okay, so let's get into the study. So I know this just looks like a bunch of pictures of grainy brains with spots on them. And that is what it is, but here's what this figure is showing. So, once again, they're working with a group of people who have misophonia, and then a group of people who do not, okay? And they're exposed to those same three categories of sounds: trigger sounds, unpleasant sounds, and neutral sounds. So pretty much, an updated version of, that last series of experiments that we talked about, right, in this initial study, from 2017. And so they're honing in on a whole collection of brain regions that aren't mentioned in their study from, several years ago. So, don't worry about what all these brain regions are. That's more detailed than is necessary to understand what they're showing here, right, with this experiment. What they're showing is that the brains of people who experience misophonia, certain parts of their brains seem to talk to each other, right, sending signals back and forth more, than in the brains of people without misophonia. So in particular, parts of the brain that are involved in processing of sounds, right, seem to interact with parts of the brain that are involved in controlling the muscles, in the face and, the production of oral sounds. Okay, so we have, all these connections in these brains, right? But for one reason or another, we all have these connections, there is in you and me and in people without misophonia, we all have these connections between these, motor focused parts of, the brain that control these muscles and auditory processing. We all have them. But for one reason or another, in the brain of somebody with misophonia, when they hear a sound, the parts of the brain that are registering that sound are interacting more with the brain regions that control these muscles, in various parts of the face and in the mouth and so on. And then they found a similarly unique relationship between our friend the insula, right? That structure that we focused on in the last paper. And again, brain regions that control many of those oral facial muscles is what they're called. Again, the muscles that are involved in things you do with your face and mouth, right? And so, to quote them from this paper, quote, "Our results show that spontaneous fluctuations in auditory visual cortex and orofacial motor cortex are synchronized to a greater extent in the misophonia group compared to the control group. This stronger spontaneous coupling between auditory or visual and orofacial motor cortex in the absence of any systematic external stimulation implies that the orofacial motor cortex in misophonia sufferers is primed to respond to sensory stimulation related to the production of trigger sounds." Okay, so in other words, the unique anatomies, right, of folks who confront misophonia are sort of primed to respond to certain sounds that they hear with severe emotional reactions, right? We know this, but not only that, but because of the unique neuroanatomy that they're finding, right? The things that make the brains of people with misophonia unique relative to people without. Those sounds tend to be sounds that other people make with their faces, right, and their mouths. So chewing, breathing, certain vowels, right, and consonants and vocal fry, and so on, right? They're honing in on precisely the parts of the body that produce those sounds that have been classically associated with misophonia now for years. And so the group did a whole bunch more science than just this. This is just their first figure. And basically, the other experiments work to demonstrate that this isn't purely or simply an unusually emotional reaction just to sounds, right? It's not like parts of the brain that detect sounds just send signals directly to parts of the brain that we know influence mood and emotion, right? And then boom, you get disgust. It's more complicated than that. There's a whole motor or muscle-related component to why it is that people with misophonia may hate to hear you eat a salad, right? And that's what they're showing with this next figure. So, there's a lot going on in this figure, I know, but don't worry, about understanding everything you're seeing, right? What they're showing is fairly simple. Well, I mean, simple to show. Not necessarily a simple experiment to conduct, of course, right? But, so starting with the left side of the figure here, okay? What they're showing is that the specific brain area that's involved in controlling the muscles of the face, right, and the mouth, the orofacial muscles, they tend to be considerably more active in the brains of people with misophonia. These red bars, right, in this graph, compared to people without misophonia, the blue bars. But then, interestingly, they also found that levels of activity in this brain region, the orofacial motor, brain region, activity in that region increased as people with misophonia started experiencing misophonic reactions of greater and greater severity. So as their reactions got more and more severe, the scientists detected escalation of activity in that specific brain region. And then, on the other side right here, they're basically just showing that there wasn't really any big difference in the auditory cortices, right? The parts of the brain that enable us to hear and understand sounds, process, sound. There was no big difference between, the brains of people with and without misophonia. So if there's no big difference in how the auditory cortex is responding between misophonics and people without misophonia, it can't be that misophonia is simply due to, this quirky response in how it is that their brains are responding to sounds alone. There's got to be something else going on there. And it seems like it's those muscle controlling areas that may be at least a major part of the story. So in other words, in people with misophonia, there's something going on in parts of their brain, right? When they hear you chomping on a salad, that are involved in the same regions in your brain that are enabling you to do that chomping, right? And then they experience that unique emotional reaction, that rage, that anxiety. So there's another really neat finding in this study that the group is presenting. While we think of misophonia as being a reaction to a set of sounds, even that characterization may be overly simple. So here's another quote from the lead author of the study. Quote, "What surprised us was that we also found a similar pattern of communication between the visual and motor regions, which reflects that misophonia can also occur when triggered by something visual." So in other words, misophonia as a term may be a misleading name for the condition that folks are confronting. Miso refers to hate or hatred of something. Phonia refers to speech. So think telephone, right? But instead of tele, which means covering distance, right, we're replacing that with just hatred. So it's kind of funny. And it makes sense given what we understood early on, but it clearly revolves entirely around a hatred of sound, right, specifically. And so what this group found is that these reactions may involve more than simply sound. And that there's even like a visual component to the emotional reactions that folks with the condition experience. And so, back to why with someone with misophonia may feel the need to immediately escape, right? Escape the dinner table when you're eating a salad. Like, yes, they're hearing the mouth sounds that you can't help but make. I mean, carrots are crunchy. Even if you're diligently chewing with your mouth closed, as you should, but they're also seeing your mouth and jaw move as the sounds are occurring, and both are of course occurring at the same time. And due to this uniquely increased connectivity between various brain regions involved in what they're seeing and in what they're hearing, they imagine themselves doing that same thing. And then, again, due to this unique neuroanatomy, they experience this visceral disgust reaction that's completely beyond their conscious control. And so they just bolt for the door. They're done with the dinner party, right? And so here's another quote from Dr. Kumar, the lead author. Quote, "This led us to believe that this communication activates something called the mirror system, which helps us process movements made by other individuals by activating our own brain in a similar way, as if we were making that movement ourselves. We think that in people with misophonia, involuntary overactivation of the mirror system leads to some kind of sense that sounds made by other people are intruding into their bodies outside of their control." Okay, so this is clearly a little bit more complicated, right, than something as simple as just a severe emotional reaction to a sound. It involves a whole process by which we all mirror each other's movements. And in the case with somebody with misophonia, they're having an emotional reaction to essentially imagining what it'd be like if they themselves were making those sounds or having those sensory experiences. But this group is making an additional argument, okay? They suggest that fundamentally the disgust and the anxiety reaction emerges from the fact that they are indeed, right, imagining themselves having that experience, but it's the fact that they have no control over that series of events that produces that negative emotional reaction, okay? They're not the ones eating the salad. They're being forced to imagine eating a salad by sitting in front of you, who's harmlessly eating a salad, right? Or saying the word spark, or exhibiting some natural vocal fry. Everybody does a little bit of vocal fry, these types of things. It's the loss of control over their own internal experience that causes them to experience that hate and disgust. It has nothing to do with the person creating the sound at all, but it's impossible to decouple, right, the person who's creating the sound from the sound itself. And so it manifests in a potentially debilitating anger or disgust reaction. Okay, so there's one last quote from Dr. Kumar that is intriguing. So, quote, "Some people with misophonia can lessen their symptoms by mimicking the action generating the trigger sound, which might indicate restoring a sense of control. Using this knowledge may help us to develop new therapies for people with the condition." End of the quote. So that's pretty interesting, right? So, frankly, he's just proposing, right, the opportunity for potential treatment, but I'm seeing him say two things in that quote. So first, the next grant application that this group is going to put out for funding, right, to conduct their research is going to focus on that question. Whether, trying to treat misophonia by what is essentially a kind of exposure therapy, right? Kind of similar to what in some cases is used to treat PTSD or OCD. Maybe applying a similar sort of strategy may mitigate the severity of the reactions of people with misophonia. But secondly, I'm seeing a series of experiments that could, be conducted that would pretty effectively demonstrate if they're correct in how they're interpreting their results. It's all about this loss of personal control, beyond purely just the anatomical findings that they're publishing in these papers. So, they can test whether it's that loss of control, over their own sensory experiences in people with misophonia that drives the disgust reactions. Or are they just these group of scientists, are they just taking a step too far in interpreting the results as indicating that it is that loss of control that causes the disgust reaction? And perhaps not even that simple, right? And so, I think we can expect to see a paper in the next few years that asks that specific question, because it's just begging to be asked. Okay, so interesting way to understand misophonia. I have my own personal story that I think may have qualified as misophonia. Not the kind of sustained, borderline debilitating, condition in some cases that we've been exploring with these studies. But aspects of my experience gave me the sense that I could empathize beyond just the nails on the chalkboard example, right, with people with this condition. And elevated stress, for me, was like central to it. So when I was in graduate school, I was given the opportunity to write a publication, a review. So, not a series of experiments that I had to conduct, rather early on when I was in graduate school. But I had to write it all within a matter of days, okay? So we're talking like 30 pages of writing with basically every single sentence referring to research of some kind, right, in less than a week. Almost like writing a legal document or something like that. And I'm sure, some people could bang that out with no problem, other people, but at least for me, I wanted to read each of the hundreds of papers that I thought might be relevant, to get a sense of what should be included and just to make sure that the publication would be worth reading when I was finished. And so it was just several days of me just reading, writing, eating a little bit, sleeping for like a few hours, and then just rinse, wash, and repeat that cycle for days. And so also my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, she was out of town. And so it was just me alone in our apartment, basically moving from like my desk to my shower to my kitchen to my bed, right, for like several days, several days straight without speaking to anyone, without even making a sound with my voice. And I imagine that schedule may feel somewhat familiar now to some folks over the course of COVID-19, but which is a meaningful concern, by the way, that I suspect it is going to result in some meaningful psychological concerns moving forward, but that's a topic for another day. Anyway, so this was a very significant departure from my normal life at the time, okay? So by day 4, I think the stress of whether I was going to be able to actually complete this thing was starting to get to me a bit, and I most definitely wasn't getting enough sleep, something like 2.5 hours a night maybe. And so here's where the experience that reminds me of, what people with misophonia describe comes into play. So at the time, my apartment was almost entirely carpeted, okay? Everything like except for the kitchen and the bathroom. So I remember on that 4th day, getting out of bed and sort of, rubbing the sleep from my face and stuff, and the sensation of the carpet on my feet started to make my skin crawl. And it took a little bit to understand like what I was experiencing, but I pretty rapidly realized that I could just not tolerate the sensation of my carpet on my feet. It was like this sustained skin crawling reaction until I put on some socks, and even the texture of the socks was a little bit uncomfortable. Like I had to sit down and my feet were sort of like, suspended. So ultimately, like I wrapped up the publication just by the deadline, like very literally just by the deadline. And at the time, while I was experiencing that weird skin crawling sensation, I could tell that something funky was going on, but my mind just like went straight to, let's just get this publication done. We'll worry about this later, in that mode. And so I completely 100%, appreciate that the stress I was experiencing in those moments was absolutely nothing compared to what many, many folks have to endure throughout the United States and throughout the world, of course. It was a tremendous privilege to even have the opportunity to write that publication, don't get me wrong, but I think it was just that sudden and sustained isolation mixed with the uncertainty that, whether I was going to even be able to pull this off, and maybe, my own neuroanatomy that predisposes me to having that kind of a reaction, that implicated stress and so on. So after a few days of normal life, that whole reaction abated and it lasted for a while, but it went away. And afterwards I started to recognize that I think I've had similarly overactive disgust reactions to completely innocuous sensory experiences in the past, specifically during periods of like sudden pressure. So, and maybe that's totally typical. Maybe this happens in everybody, and everybody tends to just be a bit of, on a bit of a hair trigger when they're like kind of stressed out. I imagine that's exactly true, but it'd be interesting to see this group, right, explore whether elevated stress causes either like an increased reaction among people who identified as having, or who self-identify as having misophonia, or if people, who wouldn't qualify as being a misophonic or, as having misophonia, if they can be pushed into that category under periods of acute stress. Be kind of interesting. And honestly, I'd basically forgotten about that whole experience until a friend contacted me a few years ago asking specifically about misophonia. And the person had just moved to a new city in which they had zero roots, no contacts, no friends. And they were just like starting from scratch, in other words, right? And the person moved in with a roommate and had some general sources of stress, right, in their lives. And they started to find it impossible to be near their roommate while they were eating specifically. And it became a pretty significant issue for them, right? Like, it legitimately disrupted their daily life. Like, they were considering moving away from the city. It was pretty intense. And so at the time, misophonia wasn't particularly established as a condition, like certainly not the kind of thing that a graduate student in neuroscience would have even studied, right? Like in class, or, probably not even very few would have been able to pursue it, from a research perspective. And, this was before 2017, right? Before that 2017 study had been published. And so there still wasn't like an ideal explanation of what might be going on. But it immediately made me think of that really strange sensory experience that I had with my carpet, that I described. So I think, studies like the ones we've talked about today shed some light on why it might be that we could, all of a sudden, experience anxiety or disgust after hearing or seeing or maybe even feeling something in our environment. And then beyond that, how we all ingest those experiences in different ways, right? Having radically different subjective experiences of the same exact things at the same exact times. You know, you rub your foot along some grass and feel immense comfort, right? Somebody else does the same and it feels like they immediately need to go to take a shower. So that's why I find this whole topic fascinating. And I think it's just one example of neuroscience probing the things that make us all different, and as a result, interesting, right? All right, that's what I have for you. If you dig this kind of discussion, maybe you'll consider subscribing and liking and so on, all those types of things. Otherwise, I will see you next week, same place, at about the same time. Thanks for watching. Oh, Scott says, misophonia, bad. Miso soup, good. Now I understand why I hate to hear someone looking in a mirror. Yeah, me too. I hate that sound. All right, see you, everybody. Thanks for watching.